The late afternoon sun bled across the Texas horizon, turning the dust into gold. Along the dry wagon road, a girl stumbled barefoot, her dress torn, her skin marked with fading bruises. Her name was Clara, though she hadn't heard it spoken with kindness in years. Her stepfather had sold her weeks ago to a traveling trader, a man whose eyes were as cruel as his fists. When she finally escaped during the trader's drunken stupor, she ran until her feet bled, not knowing where the land ended or mercy began. By the time she reached the cattle trail, her strength had run thin. The sound of horses and men made her duck behind a broken wagon, heart pounding like a trapped bird. Dust swirled around her as she peeked out. Cowboys, maybe half a dozen, driving cattle toward the north. Among them rode a tall man with a quiet steadiness about him. He didn't shout like the others. His hat was pulled low, his gaze steady. Something about him, the stillness, the way he handled his horse, felt different. When he dismounted near the wagon, Clara pressed herself against the wood, trembling. She could hear his boots crunch in the dirt. A moment later, a shadow fell over her hiding place. "You lost?" His voice was deep, calm. She froze, unable to speak. Every man she'd met since her stepfather's death had either taken or hurt. Her throat worked soundlessly before she managed to whisper, "Please, please don't hit me." The words left her mouth before she could stop them, small and broken, like a child's plea. The man said nothing. For a long moment, the only sound was the lowing of cattle in the distance and the wind through dry grass. Then he knelt down, setting a tin cup of water beside her. "Ain't no one gonna hit you," he said simply, not looking her in the eye, as though he knew she'd bolt if he did. Clara's fingers hovered over the cup before she finally took it, her hands shaking. The first swallow burned down her throat. When she dared glance up, the man was already walking back toward his horse. That night, as the cowboys made camp nearby, Clara stayed on the edge of the firelight, uncertain if she was allowed to be there. The same man, the quiet one, handed her a piece of bread and jerky without a word. She wanted to thank him but couldn't find her voice. He didn't press. He just nodded and went back to tending his fire. His name, she learned from the others, was Elias Grant, a rancher and trail driver known for speaking little and fighting only when necessary. The men respected him, even feared him a little. Yet, unlike them, he didn't laugh at her ragged clothes or the dirt on her face. He didn't stare at her with hunger. He simply treated her like someone who existed, no more, no less. That small mercy confused her more than cruelty ever had. When the night deepened and most of the men fell asleep, Clara sat awake, staring at the stars. Her shawl barely kept out the chill. From across the camp, Elias sat sharpening his knife, the glow of the fire cutting across his sharp features. There was something haunted in his eyes, a shadow that spoke of pain he didn't share. For the first time in years, Clara didn't run. She lay down by the dying fire, whispering a prayer to no one in particular. "Please don't hit me," she murmured again. But this time, it was a memory, not a plea. And though she didn't know it yet, the silent cowboy who heard her words would become the first man to teach her what mercy truly meant. The next morning dawned with a pale orange light spilling across the plains. The herd was restless, snorting and stamping as the men prepared for another long day's ride. Clara sat near the dying campfire, clutching the cup Elias had given her. She hadn't slept much. Every creak of saddle leather, every sharp voice made her flinch. The bruises on her arms were fading, but the fear in her chest hadn't yet learned how to fade. Elias watched her quietly as he cinched his saddle. He could tell she was used to being ordered, not asked. Each time someone spoke too loud or moved too fast, she tensed. He'd seen that look before, once in his mother's eyes when he was a boy. The memory of his father's drunken rage still lived somewhere deep in his bones, like a wound that refused to heal. Maybe that was why the girl's fear got to him in a way nothing else had in years. He didn't plan to take anyone with him. The cattle drive was hard enough without the trouble of a runaway girl. But when he saw her stumble as she tried to walk away, barefoot and hungry, something in him shifted. "You can ride with us till we reach Abilene," he said gruffly. "After that, you'll figure where to go." Clara hesitated, not sure if it was a trick. "You don't..." "Want anything?" she asked softly. Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "Just stay alive. That's payment enough." It was the first time a man had spoken to her without asking for something in return. The other cowboys, rough men hardened by trail life, weren't as patient. They whispered behind her back, calling her a stray or worse. But no one dared speak too loudly, not with Elias around. He didn't tolerate cruelty, not since the night his father broke a whiskey bottle over his mother's shoulder. He had been 14 then, standing between them with a rifle he was too young to hold. The sound of his mother's sobbing still haunted his dreams. That memory followed him now as the trail stretched out ahead. Clara rode behind him, her hands gripping the saddle horn. The horse's movement frightened her at first, but after a few miles the rhythm soothed her trembling. She watched Elias, how he moved with quiet confidence, how he spoke little but always helped the others without boasting. He seemed carved out of silence itself, steady and sure, the kind of man the world didn't make often anymore. During a rest stop, she finally asked, "Why are you helping me?" He glanced at her, the faintest trace of sorrow in his expression. "Because someone should have helped my ma when she needed it." That answer lingered in the air like smoke. She didn't ask more, and he didn't explain further. But from that moment on, something wordless passed between them, a fragile understanding built not on pity, but on shared scars. Days passed. The sun baked their backs, dust clung to every breath, and the herd moved slowly across the plains. Clara tried to help where she could, fetching water, cooking beans, but she was careful, always watching for signs of anger. Elias never raised his voice, never struck a hand. When she made mistakes, he simply showed her how to fix them. Each small act of patience chipped away at the wall she'd built around herself. At night, when the men laughed and traded stories, Clara would sit a few feet away, her head bowed. Elias never forced her to join, but he always made sure she ate first. Mercy wasn't in his words, it was in his quiet actions, and though neither of them spoke of it, they both knew that something fragile was beginning to grow between the silence and the dust, a flicker of trust, faint but alive. The days that followed were long and wind-scoured, the kind of days where the sun burned mercilessly and silence stretched for miles. The cattle drove onward, kicking up dust clouds that clung to skin and clothes. For Clara, each hour was a test of courage. Though Elias had given her a place among his men, she still felt like an outsider. Fragile, uncertain, a shadow among rough-spoken cowhands. She worked hard, determined not to be a burden. At first, her hands shook when she reached for a pot or rope, memories of strikes and shouted orders haunting her every movement. But Elias never barked commands. He simply showed her once, his tone calm and steady, then let her try. When she made mistakes, he corrected her quietly, never with anger. The first few times, she flinched anyway, expecting a blow that never came. Slowly, her shoulders began to relax. Still, trust was a fragile thing. The men were not cruel, but they were men hardened by years of loneliness and whiskey. Some stared too long. Others muttered crude jokes when they thought she couldn't hear. One evening, as they camped near a dry riverbed, a cowboy named Tully grabbed her wrist when she bent to fill the coffee pot. "Ain't no need to act high and holy," he sneered. Before she could pull away, a gun cocked. Elias stood behind them, his revolver drawn, his face a mask of cold fury. "Let her go," he said quietly. Tully released her at once, muttering an apology. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Elias holstered his gun, eyes still fixed on the man. "You lay a hand on her again, you won't get to ride another mile." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. No one doubted he meant every word. After that night, the men treated Clara differently. They gave her space, addressed her with a newfound respect, tinged with fear of Elias's wrath. But even as safety settled around her, she found it hard to believe it would last. She had learned that kindness was often temporary, a candle snuffed out without warning. Later that evening, while the men slept, Clara sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Elias sat a short distance away, whittling a piece of wood into something shapeless. The light caught his face, carving lines of fatigue and thoughtfulness. She watched him quietly before whispering, "Why didn't you yell at me when I spilled the stew earlier?" He didn't look up. "Because yelling don't fix nothing." She frowned, confused by the simplicity of his answer. "Every man I've known thought it did." Elias's knife paused mid-carve. "Then you ain't known the right kind of men." Something in his tone, low, honest, and a little sad, unraveled a tight knot in her chest. For the first time since she'd joined the drive, she felt the faintest flicker of safety. She didn't understand it, didn't trust it fully, but she clung to it anyway. The next morning, she woke before dawn to help gather wood. The sunrise painted the sky in streaks of rose and gold. When she tripped over a root and dropped the tin plate she carried, the clatter startled the nearby horses. Clara froze, heart pounding. Her instinct screamed to apologize, to brace for a blow. But Elias only glanced her way, his voice calm. "Ain't no harm done. Just a plate." Her breath caught. Those simple words felt heavier than any gift. No harm done. She replayed them in her mind as she worked that day, letting them soak into the parts of her heart that still expected pain. By the time the sun set, Clara had begun to understand something new about Elias. His silence wasn't emptiness, it was control. A man who had seen violence and decided never to pass it on. And though neither spoke of it, both knew the road ahead would test that vow again and again. But for now, on the long, shadowed trail, mercy was enough to keep them moving forward. The weather turned fierce without warning. The air grew thick and restless as the cattle grew uneasy, shifting and bellowing beneath a sky that had turned the color of lead. Elias sensed it coming before the first rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. "Storm's brewing," he muttered, tightening his saddle straps. "Drive the herd to low ground." Clara helped as best she could, though the wind already clawed at her hair and clothes. The sky split open with lightning, striking close enough that the ground shook. The cattle panicked, surging in every direction, their hooves a deafening drumbeat of fear. The men shouted and rode hard, trying to keep the herd together. Clara's heart raced. The storm's fury reminded her too much of the shouting men and slamming doors from her past. When a flash of lightning struck a nearby tree, she screamed and stumbled backward, losing her footing in the mud. The wind howled in her ears as rain came down in sheets. Terrified, she crawled beneath the nearest wagon, wrapping her arms around herself, whispering through chattering teeth, "Please, please don't hit me. I'll be good, I promise." Elias found her there minutes later, soaked and trembling, eyes wide with panic. He crouched down beside her, his hat dripping rain. "Clara!" he shouted above the storm. "You can't stay under there. The wagon could tip." She didn't respond, lost in the fog of memory and fear. Without another word, Elias ducked under the wagon and gently took her by the arm. She flinched so hard it made him freeze. "Hey," he said more softly, his voice steady and low, "ain't no one gonna hurt you. You hear me? You're safe." She blinked, struggling to focus on his voice over the roar of thunder. For a moment, she saw not a man's shadow looming to strike, but a strong figure shielding her from the storm. Something in his tone reached through her fear. She let him pull her free. They ran through the rain toward a rocky rise a few hundred yards off, where Elias knew there was a cave used by travelers. The wind whipped so fiercely that the rain felt like needles. Twice, she nearly fell, but each time his arm was there, steady and sure. By the time they reached the cave, both were drenched and shivering. Elias quickly built a fire from the dry kindling he carried in his saddlebag. As the flames crackled to life, shadows danced across the cave walls. Clara sat close to the heat, hugging her knees. The orange light revealed the exhaustion on her face. Mud streaked her skin, her hair hung in wet strands. Elias shrugged off his coat and placed it around her shoulders. She tried to protest, but he only said, "Don't argue." For a long while, neither spoke. The storm raged outside, lightning flashing, thunder shaking the ground, but inside the cave, there was a fragile calm. Finally, Clara whispered, "You shouldn't have come after me." Elias looked at her across the fire, eyes soft but unreadable. "Couldn't just leave you out there." "Don't sit right with me," her voice cracked. No one's ever come back for me before. Elias leaned back against the stone wall, his jaw tightening. Well, he said after a pause, maybe it's time that changed. Outside, the storm began to fade. The rain softened to a steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the earth calming after rage. Clara stared into the flames, her eyelids heavy, her trembling finally easing. Before sleep claimed her, she heard Elias's quiet voice say, "You're safe now. No man'll lay a hand on you while I'm breathing." It was a simple vow spoken low, meant for no one but her. Yet it carried the weight of everything she'd ever prayed for and never received: shelter, protection, mercy. And as the storm died outside the cave, another began to end within her. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and sagebrush. The plains shimmered with puddles that mirrored the wide Texas sky. For the first time since joining the cattle drive, Clara felt something she hadn't dared to before: peace. The memory of the thunder still made her flinch now and then, but Elias's words from the night before echoed louder than fear. "You're safe now. No man'll lay a hand on you while I'm breathing." When they rode out of the valley the next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, warming her face. The herd moved slower now, the men quieter, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe because the storm had reminded them of how small they were under heaven's fury. Elias rode ahead as he always did, silent, watchful. Clara followed, her body sore, her spirit lighter than it had been in years. Days passed. The rhythm of the trail became familiar: the creak of leather, the lowing of cattle, the hiss of coffee boiling at dawn. Clara began to hum softly while she worked, old tunes she half remembered from childhood. Sometimes the men would glance her way, surprised to hear music from the girl who once trembled at every sound. Elias never said a word about it, but one evening, when she sang a line under her breath, he looked up and smiled. Not a full smile, just the kind that flickers and disappears before you can be sure you saw it. She began helping more, tending to the campfire, cleaning the tack, even soothing the calves that got separated from their mothers. Her hands were still thin, but they were steady now. One afternoon, Elias found her crouched beside a small injured calf, whispering softly as she cleaned a cut on its leg. The gentleness in her touch stopped him cold. "You got away with creatures," he said, kneeling beside her. Clara glanced up shyly. "They don't talk back," she said with a faint smile. "And they don't hit." Elias's jaw tightened. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. But when he stood, his voice was softer. "You can stay near me when you work. Safer that way." She nodded, and though she didn't say it, the simple offer meant more than any promise she'd ever been given. As the drive stretched on, Clara's laughter, quiet and rare, became a sound the men grew used to hearing. She earned her nickname, Little Dove, from an older hand named Murphy, who said she was small, soft, and keeps fluttering, but never flies away. The name stuck. For the first time, she didn't mind being noticed. Still, when the campfires burned low, a new worry began to form in her heart. The closer they got to Abilene, the closer she was to being left behind. She didn't want to burden Elias, but the thought of being alone again filled her with quiet panic. One night, as the moon climbed high, Clara sat apart from the camp, her knees pulled to her chest. Elias came over, his spurs jingling softly. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "What'll happen when we reach the town?" He sat down beside her, staring out across the plains. "That's up to you," he said. "You'll be free to go wherever you want," she hesitated. "And if I don't know where to go?" Elias looked at her then, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "Then you'll figure it out, or stay on for a while." "No one's gonna force your hand." Those words, "no one's gonna force your hand," stuck with her long after he walked away. For a girl who'd spent her whole life being told what to do, the idea of choice felt like freedom itself. That night, beneath the endless stretch of stars, Clara smiled to herself for the first time. Not because someone had shown her kindness, but because she was beginning to believe she might deserve it. The days on the trail had grown easier for Clara. The cattle moved steadily, The sun warmed her face instead of burning it, and Elias's quiet presence had become a steady comfort. Yet even in this fragile peace, shadows of the past lurked. Clara knew that the men who had hurt her, or profited from her suffering, did not vanish simply because she was learning to trust again. She had learned that danger often returned when least expected, and sometimes it came in familiar faces. It was a late afternoon when the shadow she had feared appeared. Dust billowed on the horizon, stirred by horses charging fast. The men glanced up, hands instinctively moving toward reins and weapons. Clara's heart caught in her throat when a familiar figure rode into view. A man with a cruel grin, the same traitor who had sold her weeks ago. He wasn't alone. Two armed men flanked him, their eyes scanning the trail like predators. "Elias Grant!" the traitor called out, voice mocking. "Looks like you've taken quite the prize." Clara froze, her stomach twisting. She knew that tone. He was claiming ownership, reminding the world he had rights over her. And though she had escaped him before, she realized now how vulnerable she had been then, and how vulnerable she might be again. Elias's jaw tightened. He did not shout. He did not brandish his weapon yet. Instead, he slowly dismounted, hands resting near his holster, his eyes never leaving the traitor's. "She ain't yours," he said quietly but with deadly certainty. "She never was." The traitor laughed, the sound cold and sharp. "She's my property. I'll take her back, Grant, whether you like it or not." Clara shrank behind Elias, trembling. The memories of abuse came rushing back. The cruel strikes, the long nights, the cold indifference. She wanted to run, wanted to vanish into the brush, but the herd was vast, the terrain dangerous. She had nowhere to hide. Elias's stance shifted. He did not raise his gun immediately, but there was no mistaking the tension in his shoulders. He knew the man's type. He had faced them before. One wrong move and the confrontation would turn deadly. He had to protect her, not just from harm, but from the fear that had haunted her entire life. "You lay a hand on her," Elias said, voice low, "and you won't live to regret it." The traitor's smile faltered for a moment. "You'd kill me for a girl?" "I would," Elias answered simply. The words were not a threat. They were a statement of fact. He had seen what fear could do to a girl, and he refused to let it happen again. The standoff stretched for a tense minute. Horses pawed the ground, the herd murmured uneasily, and Clara felt herself shaking, caught between terror and relief. The traitor, sensing the resolve in Elias's eyes, finally wheeled his horse around, muttering curses under his breath. His men followed, leaving a swirl of dust behind them. Clara sank to her knees, tears mingling with dirt and sweat. Elias crouched beside her, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said. "You're safe. I told you no man's gonna lay a hand on you while I'm breathing." She looked up at him, still trembling. For the first time, she felt the truth of his words, not just as comfort, but as a promise. The shadow of her past had arrived, threatening to drag her back into terror, but Elias had met it with calm resolve and unwavering strength. In that moment, Clara realized that safety was not a gift. It was a choice, and Elias had chosen to protect her, no matter the cost. As the dust settled and the horizon cleared, Clara breathed deeply, feeling a fragile spark of hope. For the first time in her life, she was no longer running, not from men, not from fear, not from the world that had once seemed so cruel. She was standing, and someone strong and silent was standing with her. The calm after the traitor's retreat lasted only a few days. The sun had dipped low behind distant hills, casting long shadows across the prairie when disaster struck. Clara was gathering water from a nearby creek while the men checked the cattle, the world alive with the soft hum of evening. Then a distant glow caught her eye, a flicker of orange that didn't belong to the campfire. Before she could warn anyone, smoke and flames erupted from the pens where the cattle were tied. Panic swept through the herd, hooves thundering across dry earth, kicking up dust and sparks. Clara's heart leapt to her throat as she realized the unmistakable truth. The traitor had returned. Not content to simply reclaim her, he sought to destroy everything Elias had built. Chaos erupted. Men shouted over the roar of the fire, trying to corral the terrified cattle. Horses reared, their neighs cutting through the crackling of flames. Clara froze, overwhelmed by fear. She had faced cruelty before, but never so close to such destruction, never so close to losing herself again. A sudden hand grabbed her arm. It was Elias. "Stay close," he commanded, his voice low but edged with steel. He didn't panic. He never did. He moved with precision, assessing threats, positioning men, calming the herd where he could. His eyes met hers for a brief second. "I won't let them take you," he said, and Clara clung to him, her trembling fingers clutching his coat. The trader's men appeared through the smoke, brandishing weapons, faces twisted with greed and malice. One of them lunged toward Clara, and time seemed to slow. Elias reacted instantly, a gunshot cutting through the night air, sending the man sprawling to the ground. Clara screamed, but Elias didn't pause. He fought through the chaos, every movement controlled and precise, shielding her from the men and the flames. The fire crackled dangerously close, consuming wood and dry brush. Sparks rained down like deadly rain. Clara coughed, her eyes streaming, but Elias kept a protective arm around her, leading her through smoke and heat. Every instinct in her screamed to flee, but she knew she couldn't survive without him. His presence was her anchor amid the inferno. Two more of the trader's men emerged from the shadows. Elias fired again, his hand steady, his aim unerring. One fell, another fled into the darkness. Clara watched, fear and awe mixing into a dizzying swirl. He wasn't just defending her. He was standing between her and the full weight of her past, the horrors she'd thought would follow her forever. Finally, the last of the men fled, leaving the trader nowhere in sight. The fire still raged, but the immediate danger to Clara had passed. Elias guided her back to a safer spot, his coat still draped over her shoulders, protecting her from falling embers. They both coughed, choked, and shivered, but neither let go. When the flames finally subsided and the remnants of the pens smoldered, Elias turned to Clara. She could see soot streaked across his face, sweat and grime matted in his hair. "You're alive," he said simply. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thanks to you." He said nothing more, simply letting the silence carry what words could not. His protection, his patience, his silent strength spoke louder than any declaration. For the first time, Clara truly understood that mercy wasn't a fleeting act. It was a steadfast shield, unyielding even in the face of danger and destruction. That night, under a sky streaked with stars and smoke, Clara lay on a makeshift blanket, shivering but alive. Elias kept watch nearby, silent as ever, and for the first time she didn't feel alone. She realized that the world could be harsh, cruel, and relentless. But she had found someone willing to stand between her and that cruelty, someone whose mercy could turn even a night of fire into a promise of safety. The morning after the fire brought a quiet that was almost surreal. The charred remnants of the cattle pens smoldered in the early light, and the herd grazed nervously a short distance away. Clara sat on a log, wrapped in Elias's spare coat, her body aching from the smoke, the heat, and the terror she had endured. She was alive, yes, but every muscle in her body screamed that survival was never without cost. Elias approached silently, as he always did, carrying a small bundle of clean cloths and water. He knelt beside her without a word, setting the items down. "We'll get you cleaned up," he said, voice calm, measured. He didn't wait for thanks or protest. He simply helped her remove the soot from her face and arms, washing cuts with care. Each touch was deliberate, steady, and gentle, a quiet reassurance that no harm would come from him. Clara flinched at first. Old habits die hard, and her body remembered every strike, every harsh word, every shove. But Elias never hesitated, never raised a hand in anger. Instead, he guided her through the process with patience, talking softly about the simplest things: the color of the sky, the distant hills, the herd grazing peacefully in the distance. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased. She began to trust that not all hands were cruel, not all words carried pain. Days passed, and the physical healing began to match the emotional. Elias ensured she had enough to eat, water to drink, and rest to recover. He taught her how to tend small wounds, how to care for the burns on her arms and hands, and how to take stock of the herd when she felt unsure. The men in his crew, once skeptical of her presence, started to accept her quietly. They gave her space, but they also offered small nods and gestures of respect. She wasn't a burden, not anymore. Evenings became a time of quiet reflection. Clara would sit near the fire, brushing her hair, mending clothes, or simply watching the stars. Elias often sat nearby, sometimes whittling, sometimes staring into the flames. Words were rare between them, but the silence was filled with understanding. Clara had learned that he didn't speak much because he listened more, because his actions mattered more than any empty promises, and she had learned that safety could exist not in grand declarations, but in the constancy of presence. One night, after a particularly long day of rebuilding, Clara's nightmares returned. She awoke with a start, trembling, her mind replaying the fire, the traitor's threats, the panic in the herd. Elias, sensing her distress, quietly moved to her side. He didn't scold or dismiss her fear. He simply placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he whispered. "Ain't no one gonna hurt you. Not while I'm here." She let herself lean into that assurance, letting the warmth of his presence calm her racing heart. For the first time, she realized that healing wasn't just about the body. It was about learning to believe in kindness again, to accept protection without shame, to trust without expecting betrayal. As the days stretched into weeks, Clara's confidence grew. She could tend the fire alone, check the herd, and even joke lightly with the men without fear. She had begun to smile in a way that didn't feel like a mask. She had started to hum while working, not because she was afraid, but because she could. Elias noticed these small changes but never commented aloud. He understood that trust, once broken, needed time to rebuild. Every gesture of hers, every act of independence, every laugh, every moment of quiet courage was a victory. In turn, he found a quiet satisfaction in watching her grow, knowing that his silent commitment had helped her reclaim herself. Through his patient guidance, Clara learned a truth she had long forgotten: that mercy could be enduring, that safety could be steady, and that love, if nurtured slowly and quietly, could heal even the deepest wounds. The cattle drive was drawing to an end. Abilene lay ahead, its distant buildings glinting under the setting sun. The trail had been long, dusty, and exhausting, but it had also been transformative for Clara. She no longer flinched at every sudden movement or whispered threat. She no longer expected pain at every gesture of kindness. With Elias by her side, she had begun to understand the rare and fragile thing that was trust. That evening, the camp settled early. The men, tired from the day's journey, gathered around the fire to eat and share quiet conversation. Clara sat at the edge, a small smile tugging at her lips as she peeled apples for the men. Elias watched her from across the fire, arms folded, the fading light catching the sharp lines of his face. His eyes softened when they met hers, a subtle acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. As the fire crackled, Clara finally spoke, her voice tentative but steady. "Elias, why are you being so kind to me?" Elias looked down at the fire, letting the embers glow between them for a moment. He had spent so long keeping his emotions carefully contained, always silent, always vigilant. "Because someone should have been kind to you a long time ago," he said finally, his voice low but firm. There was no anger, no judgment, just truth. Clara's hands stilled, the apples forgotten. She had never heard words like that directed at her before. Not from anyone. She swallowed hard, trying to grasp the weight of what he had said. It was more than protection. It was recognition of her worth, an acknowledgement that her life mattered beyond the utility she had been forced to serve in the past. She looked up at him, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "And will you keep being kind?" she asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. Elias met her gaze steadily. "If you want me to," he said. "Ain't a promise I make lightly." Clara's chest tightened with a mixture of hope and fear. She had spent her life running from men who promised protection and care, only to betray her. But something in Elias's calm, unwavering demeanor made her believe he meant what he said. Slowly, carefully, she nodded. "Then I'll stay," she whispered. The words were simple, but they carried a weight she hadn't known she could bear. Staying wasn't just a choice. It was a declaration that she trusted someone, that she believed she could be safe and valued. The night deepened, and the fire's glow dimmed, leaving the sky a vast canvas of stars. The world felt impossibly large and yet intimate in that moment. Clara leaned back slightly, breathing in the crisp night air, and for the first time felt the possibility of a life beyond fear. She didn't have to flee, she didn't have to hide, and she didn't have to shrink from the world. Elias settled a short distance away, keeping watch as he always did. He didn't speak, but his presence spoke volumes. In his silence, Clara felt the reassurance of unwavering protection, the quiet promise of steadfastness, and the subtle warmth of care. That night, beneath the wide, starlit sky, Clara finally allowed herself to dream. She dreamed not of escape, not of survival, not of fleeting moments of safety. She dreamed of a life where kindness was constant, where mercy was real, and where love was built on trust and respect. Elias's quiet watch and her decision to stay created a fragile harmony between them, a beginning of something neither had expected, but both needed. They had traveled together across the plains, faced danger, and endured the scars of the past. Now under the stars, they had something rare, a choice, a connection, and the promise that no harm would come to her while he could prevent it. In that moment, Clara realized the world could be harsh, cruel, and unpredictable, but with someone steadfast by her side, she could not only survive, she could begin to live. And Elias, silent yet vigilant, understood that protection and mercy could be a language as powerful as words. Under the stars, they both understood that trust had been given and accepted, and for the first time, Clara felt a peace she had never known. Months had passed since the end of the cattle drive, and the harsh, unforgiving plains of Texas had become a distant memory. Clara's life had transformed in ways she had never thought possible. With Elias, she had built a sanctuary on his small Colorado ranch, a place where silence was not filled with fear, where mercy was not conditional, and where trust was cultivated through patient, steady care. The ranch was modest, but to Clara it felt vast. Rolling pastures stretched beyond the horizon, dotted with grazing cattle and wildflowers. The rhythm of farm life replaced the constant uncertainty of the trail, each day punctuated by work that gave her hands purpose and her heart space to heal. Clara had grown into her role on the ranch. She tended the garden, milked the cows, and helped with household chores. Her laughter, once rare and timid, now mingled with the clucking of hens and the lowing of cattle. Each task she performed was done with a quiet confidence, born not only of necessity but of a life reclaimed. She no longer flinched at sudden movements or loud voices. The fear that had once dominated her existence had been replaced by something infinitely more powerful, the certainty that she belonged somewhere, and with someone who would never let her be harmed again. Elias remained a steady presence in her life, quiet as always, but ever attentive. He repaired fences with calm precision, prepared meals with careful hands, and ensured that Clara had all she needed. Their relationship had settled into a rhythm defined not by words, but by mutual respect and understanding. When she accidentally dropped a basket of vegetables one afternoon, she froze, her heart still carrying traces of old fears, but Elias simply knelt, gathered the scattered produce, and said, "It's all right. No harm done. That simple phrase, repeated countless times over weeks, had become a mantra for her. She smiled, realizing that in this home, mistakes were met with patience, not punishment. The evenings were spent together beneath the wide Colorado sky. Stars stretched across the heavens, their light pure and unwavering, a reminder of the constancy and stability that now defined her life. Clara often sat on the porch, her hands resting in her lap, watching Elias tend to small repairs or care for the animals. Sometimes he would glance her way, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them, a silent conversation that required no words. In that quiet understanding, Clara discovered that trust and love could flourish not in grand declarations, but in the quiet assurance of someone who would always be there. Over time, Clara's nightmares began to fade. She slept more soundly, no longer startled awake by imagined threats. The trauma that had once defined her existence was softened, replaced by hope and a growing sense of safety. She learned to laugh freely, to speak without fear, and to embrace the small joys of life, the warmth of the sun on her face, the soft brush of wind through the fields, the sound of a calf's low call across the pasture. Each moment reinforced the truth she had slowly come to accept, that she was deserving of care, respect, and love. Elias, for his part, understood that healing was a gradual process. He never forced her to confront her past or speak of it if she was unready. Instead, he offered consistency, patience, and protection, the cornerstones of the mercy he had promised her from the very beginning. Together, they built not just a home, but a sanctuary, a place where the frightened girl who once whispered, "Please, don't hit me," could finally be seen, valued, and cherished. In the quiet of the Colorado evening, with the stars overhead and the gentle sounds of the ranch surrounding them, Clara and Elias shared a peaceful coexistence. It was a life born of patience, courage, and the transformative power of kindness. For Clara, the journey from fear to trust had reached its destination, a home not only of safety, but of hope, love, and enduring peace.